Today's guest has a very eclectic background as a producer and a director. We'll get to it right in a moment.
Well, I'm here with one of my favorite bears. It's Mr. Chocolate. Hey, Mr. Chocolate. He's been with me for over a decade, and he's been my good friend. Oh, he's a big bear. He's a big bear. A very big bear. Wow. I will die for these animals. I will die for these animals. I will die for these animals.
We're gonna find out. I'll find out on Monday.
So she let him in the house to use the telephone, and while he was doing that, Michael Perry stepped out of the laundry room, and that's when he shot her. This was the vehicle that Michael Perry and Jason Burkett was after. 3 people died for this car.
Eden does not exist here.
Roland, just read it any way you're comfortable.
Okay, tell me when. This is a poem by Randall Jarrell, who, like me, served in the Army Air Corps in World War II. It's called The Death of the Ball Turret Gunner. From my mother's sleep, I fell into the state, and I hunched in its belly till my wet fur froze. 6 miles from Earth, loosed from its dream of life, I woke to black flak and the nightmare fighters.
Well, welcome to the latest edition of Westdoc Online. Don't say that we don't have a variety of material on here, which we certainly do. Today's episode is with a producer and a director who has a very interesting background, which I really didn't know about until I started doing a little digging. And his latest film, which is called The Cold Blue, we're going to talk about. But first, let's meet producer, director, writer, Erik Nelson. Hi, Erik. How are you? Hi.
I'm good.
Where are we seeing you from? You're in Northern California, I believe, right?
You're seeing me in my home office, Fortress of Solitude in Santa Cruz, California.
Santa Cruz. That's a really nice place up there. Those clips, they look like they're from different producers and different directors. And can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to be where you are today?
Well, that's a interesting question. Well, if you sense a certain amount of eclecticism, you're probably correct. I contain multitudes in my career. I came up in rock videos in the early 80s, working with MTV, then had a long stint in television, long stint in television, till about 2003, 2004, producing and directing massive amounts of highbrow, lowbrow, and no-brow television. And then I collided with Werner Hertzog in 2003, and we set out to produce, we didn't set out to do anything, but we sort of fell into working together, and we did 4 films actually. Grizzly Man, Encounters at the End of the World, Cave of Forgotten Dreams, and Into the Abyss. And he narrated an animated film I directed called Dinotasia. He executive produced a feature doc I did a couple of years ago called A Gray State. And I've just completed a new film called The Cold Blue. So yeah, it's covered a fair amount of ground in my 40 years in this great business called show.
So let's talk about Cold Blue. I mean, well, let me back up a minute because I'm interested in Werner Herzog because he's kind of a superstar in our milieu. How did you bump into him and collaborate? How did that happen?
I met him at must have been the 2003 Jackson Hole Film Festival. He was attending, I was attending. On behalf, I had just produced a film for the Discovery Channel that, let's just say, revolved around a 20-foot long mechanical great white shark, which we transported to the Jackson Hole Film Festival. That's only a sidebar. But anyway, Hertzog was there. I saw him across a crowded lawn, went over, introduced myself, and we just hit it off. And it turned out that he lived and still lives about a quarter, maybe a half mile away from my office, my then office in Los Angeles. So I just said, can I be of assistance in any way? If you need dubs made or anything you want, you know, I'm a fan. I'm happy to assist you in any way possible. So I had been developing Grizzly Man as a project that I was going to direct, and I mentioned it to him that I thought it would make a terrific feature film. One man in nature. Leonardo DiCaprio at the time was a member of Treadwell's foundation, so I thought it'd be a perfect, what actor wouldn't want to work with Werner Hertzog, a one-man show called Grizzly Man. But Verner latched onto the documentary and very politely muscled me off it and directed it. So I put my producer hat on and he directed it. And that worked out well for all concerned. And then we did Encounters at the End of the World, and then Cave of Forgotten Dreams, the 3D film. And then Into the Abyss was the last of the four that we did together.
So Grizzly Man is a classic, powerful, disturbing documentary. One of my favorites. That's why I had the clip at the beginning of the cold opening. So how did you find that footage, or did you know him, or how did that come about? A little bit on Grizzly Man.
I read a news story about what had happened, that this guy who was up there had been killed along with his girlfriend, and they mentioned a connection with the Discovery Channel, who I'd been working a lot with. So I instantly thought there was a project there, not a feature film, a TV project. So I reached out through various circuitous means to the Treadwell estate, to Jewel Pavalak, who was his partner professionally and occasionally privately. And she really was fixated on doing a feature film. And she asked me, would you be interested in producing, I don't want to do this on television, I want to do a feature film. So I said, okay, let's figure out how to do that. And at the same exact time, that's when Hertzog collided with me. So we had the footage, the idea, the relationships, and someone had to go up to Alaska and dodge killer flies and mosquitoes. And to be honest with you, I didn't want to do it. And it seemed like, as all good things, it seemed like a good idea at the time.
So you didn't go to Alaska and dodge killer flies?
I did four. I've done 4 films with Werner Hertzog. I have not once ever been on the set with him. Not once.
Well, maybe that's a good thing. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it just, we would obviously be very close. We'd closely work together in the editing and in pre-production, and endless, wonderful, as you can imagine, conversations in post-production and generally, but never did. That's his business. I'd always inquire or be kept posted on how it was going, but he's an incredibly responsible, terrifically budget-conscious force of nature in the field, and there's absolutely no reason to get up his grill. He has his working methodology with people he likes to work with. I was always invited, I just never went.
So The Cold Blue is another extremely unique, very involving film. How did that, you want to tell us a little bit about this World War II history film, and how did that come about?
Well, interestingly, The Cold Blue is the 3rd film I've done revolving around the archive footage of a filmmaker. Obviously, Grizzly Man, Treadwell was a filmmaker, considered himself a filmmaker, and then Hertzog, in my opinions, was quite a filmmaker. Gray State was revolved around a conspiracy theorist, conspiracy-minded, obsessed Iraq vet who was a filmmaker who was making his feature opus masterpiece called A Gray State. And collapsed into himself with this very frightening and shocking denouement. But it revolved around his footage, and most of the footage is his footage in the film. And Cold Blue, oddly, is William Wyler's footage that he filmed in 1943 when he was making his classic documentary, The Memphis Belle, which was 43 minutes long, but there's another 14 hours of footage that we discovered in the National Archives, all of his outtakes, his raw camera loads. And once I came across that footage, probably as an antidote to the harrowing experience of doing Gray State, I wanted something a little lighter and less soul-destroying, if you will. So I embarked on Cold Blue, kind of like a dessert, kind of wash the intenseness of the Gray State experience from my mind. And as, again, my motto, career motto, it seemed like a good idea at the time.
So what you're not saying here, and I want to hear a little bit of the backstory, you found the 14 or 15 hours worth of William Wyler footage, classic multi-Oscar winning Hollywood director doing his time in the Army Air Force during World War II, but the footage is 75 years old and it's faded and it's almost unwatchable. So how did you attack that?
Well, that was the restoration process. I knew that the footage was very close to the master footage. It wasn't negative, but it, in some cases, was one generation off the negative. It had deteriorated. The sprockets were going. It wasn't in great shape, but the National Archives felt it needed to be preserved and transferred. So we paid to transfer it to 4K, painstakingly transfer the 35 reels. There were 35 reels, about 20 minutes each, to massive 80 terabytes of hard drives, shuttling drives from my production office in Los Angeles back to Washington and back and forth. Then we loaded it into an Avid, and then we made the movie. I cut the movie, did the interviews, put the film together, and we had a 72-minute cut. And then we attacked the restoration, frame by frame, shot by shot, taking out artifacts, removing, we called it the blue lines of death. In the processing lab in England in 1943, a technician had scratched all of Wyler's, not all, but a great deal of Wyler's raw footage, had put 2 blue scratches in it. And every version of the Memphis Belle ever made features those scratches in strategic points. So we had to digitally remove those, and that took a fair amount of time. So it was part one was the artistic, what's the film, how does it go together? And part 2 was high-end janitorial work, putting in the restored footage, doing the sound design and construction, and Richard Thompson, who scored Grizzly Man, doing the original soundtrack. So the footage, the soundtrack, and the sound design all met up about 5 months after we locked the first cut, or the rough cut or the fine cut.
So, I want to hear a little bit about the timeline here. And I know that you started before the Peter Jackson film, and it's maybe a touchy subject, the Peter Jackson they shall not grow old. There's the making of after that film, and Peter has, I forgot what it's called, I'm sure you know, in New Zealand, the digital, the equivalent.
Yep.
Yeah, and I don't know how many 100 people work there, and what the budget of that film was and the amount of time that it took, but what made you think, what did you know that we don't know about restoring film? What made you think that you could do what you ended up doing, which is breathtaking and beautiful, which we're going to see more of in a second? How did you do that?
Well, I knew the footage we wouldn't have done the 4K transfer if we didn't know the footage was in good shape. It had scratches and dirt, and some of the reels weren't as good as the others, but I knew it looked good. And what Peter Jackson did was full animation. He basically found the World War I footage, added the missing frames, got it to the right speed, and then literally animated over it, put in all the color, put in did a massive amount of just incredibly high-end technical recreation, restoration, colorization, animation, whatever you want to call it. And I think there's about 20 minutes of that footage in his film, 20 or 30 minutes, and then there's stills in black and white. So I imagine it was a very, very laborious, time-consuming process for him. We were lucky in that we already had the color, we had the footage, we didn't have to imagine what the colors were. The colors were on the Technicolor film. We had to enhance it, but we knew what we were going with. We knew what references to use. And it was a much less involving process. Our restoration team was 2 guys, basically. It was very much a garage band film, very small. And I've always been very proud of how small my credit rolls are. Maybe that's something what Verner and I share. We tend to keep it to a very small core unit. And the people I've worked with on many of my films, including Richard Thompson, the composer, David Hughes. I noticed you had a clip from my animated film, Dinotasia. David Hughes did all the dinosaur sound design, and I had no idea until this project, The Cold Blue, just what a serious sound designer he was. When he told me just before we went to record the B-17s, he was wrapping his film. He couldn't come to the phone, and I said, "What's the film?" And he said, "Oh, it's called Black Panther." He was the sound designer of Black Panther, something I did not know, because he was just a guy who I now realize has been slumming with us, working because he enjoyed the freedom and the creativity he had with my films, kind of outside the studio system. So
Slumming with
definitely,
you seems to be a good idea because you make some great films. Let's take a look at a short clip on the making of.
The Cold Blue is a brand new film that takes William Wyler's raw footage and creates an entirely new creative project from original footage. It's the first time that 16mm World War II footage of any sort, let alone color, gorgeous Technicolor shot by one of Hollywood's greatest directors, has ever been transferred directly to 4K. And by transferring it to 4K, it allows us to blow the film up. Expand to a widescreen without losing any, and I repeat, any of its resolution and quality.
It feels to me like you have broken a glass ceiling, so to speak. I mean, when Peter Jackson does something like this in New Zealand with Weta and his 100 or 500 employees or whatever it is down there, and it was brilliant, it was wonderful, that's one thing, and it's $10 million or whatever the budget was. But you say there was 2 guys in a garage doing it, and it's breathtaking, and it seems like that you've opened the door for a whole new genre of films and things that can be done by filmmakers at a price, at a budget.
well, it's in technology, the price goes down. We saw CGI become more and more affordable. My dinosaur film would have been quadruple, 10 times the cost it was. And we were able to do that because it got more and more affordable to do CGI. That was another garage band project. Cave of Forgotten Dreams was the first 3D documentary. And Verner pretty much assembled the cameras in the cave to get it done. And I believe it was the first documentary to use drones. We had we brought a proto drone with us down to France, and I asked the guy, because I was aware this guy built this thing, I asked him to come down to do behind the scenes work, but to kind of fly the drone around and see if Verner would respond to it. And when Verner went up, who was always curious, he explained to him what it was, and they mounted a 3D camera on the drone. So the first shot of Cave of Forgotten Dreams is the drones going through the vineyard and lifting up. So, you know, technology, I've always been very keen when I put my producer hat on to see what's the new technology. You know, I took Verner to see Avatar when it opened, ironically, because I was really intrigued and I thought that 3D was the next generation of documentaries, and put rolled the dice in a big way on Cave of Forgotten Dreams, and it worked out. So this sort of restoration has always been in the back of my mind because I've done a number of history films that all revolved around restoring stock footage. So this is not new to me. And we actually did the lip readers. We did a film on the 24 hours before John Kennedy was assassinated that restored incredible footage of Kennedy's trip around Texas. And we brought in a lip reader to read the lips of Jackie and JFK when they were talking, and we overdubbed their voices in this film. And Peter Jackson used that technique too. Again, I'm not saying I was the first, but I hadn't heard about it, let's put it that way. So it's so competitive in documentaries that if you can, and competitive not in the filmmakers competing with one another, but just to get an audience's attention, that you really have to be on the lookout for interesting things and interesting technology, but obviously not have the technology dictate the film. I'm hoping that people don't get obsessed with how the cold blue looks. I hope they get swept away with the film and they don't think about the technology. It's not presented as a gimmick, it's just what it is.
What was from the business production side, what was the process of raising the money, and I see it's Vulcan presents this. I mean, when did they come in, and what was the relationship with Wyler's daughter, Catherine Wyler?
Well, Vulcan and I each of us put up half the money. So for the first and last time in my career, I got into a co-financing arrangement with a billionaire. So that was just a business arrangement. And the Memphis Belle footage, the footage in the National Archives, was done work for hire for the government. So the footage is public domain. Anybody can access that footage in the National Archives. That's not exclusive to anybody. So I made the cold blue, but I always knew that I needed, my white whale was the Wyler estate. I knew they were out there, and I knew I didn't have to work with them, but I knew I should. You know, there's a difference between you could do something and should do something, and I knew I should work and reach out to the Wylers. So I finally reached out through an intermediary to Catherine and got her on the phone, and it already finished. We were in restoration now at the cold blue, it was done. And I told her what I was doing, and she was open to it, but a little skeptical. But she said, what I really want to do, Erik, I'm looking to find a print of the Memphis Belle that we can restore. You know, the prints have faded, and we're trying to find the best print and make it look better. And I said, kind of glibly, there are no good prints. They've all deteriorated. The National Archives print looks like crap, and the Imperial War Museum's print is 5% better than that and looks like crap with the blue lines. And I said, I think the only way you're ever going to restore the Memphis Belle is to recut it from scratch, assuming that your dad's movie is all in those outtakes, which I don't know if they are or not. And I won't get into the details, but about a month later, I had a 2-week lull before Christmas with an offline editor. And I just said, you know what, just for fun, let's just see if we can even do this. Let's go to the raw footage. We're all familiar with it. Let's see if we can recut the Memphis Belle from scratch. And it took 2 weeks to replace all 500 shots of the Memphis Belle. We found all but about 1 minute of the footage in Wyler's footage. And we threw that into the pot. So we restored that along with the cold blue, which obviously thrilled the Wylers, and it created what I call a level playing field. The cold blue exists in its world, and the original film exists in its world. And we've recently restored the 5.1, we've restored the soundtrack to the Memphis Belle. David Hughes went in and we massaged the existing soundtrack and equalized it and brought it up and really did some very unobtrusive work to make it sound great. So I felt we owed it to the Wylers and we owed it to history to restore this film properly. So we haven't really rolled out that Memphis Belle restoration yet, but it's all part of the Cold Blue project.
Can we go back to the business side of it? And I thought it was kind of funny that you said the first and last time you went into business with a billionaire. So what is the process of releasing, and where are people going to be able to see this film? I know it's actually coming up very soon. I'd like to hear what you tell us about the film.
Well, we have a double shot. Interestingly enough, Fathom is putting it in theaters on May 23rd. I don't know if this piece will air before that or afterwards, but don't worry, the film will be on HBO on June 6th and then on HBO Now, so it'll be readily available. So we sold it to HBO. They acquired the film after its premiere last June. And when Fathom released the Peter Jackson film to huge success, and I was probably one of the very few people who was absolutely knew that this genre of big screen history was going to find an audience. That's why I made the film in the first place. We had missed our theatrical window, but with Fathom, we were able to reopen the theatrical window. And what's interesting is, and what I love about the Fathom model is, unlike Cave of Forgotten Dreams, which opened up in the 4 traditional art houses or the 20 art houses, or expands to 100 art houses, you know how those films roll out. Cold Blue is going in 720 theaters and multiplexes across the country. So it's the people's documentary. And I really like that. I like the idea of documentaries being seen in venues that don't normally show documentaries. I think this is a really exciting new development in distribution, and it's good for the filmmaker. The Jackson film made a fortune. I'm not sure, in fact, I'm almost positive we'll make nowhere near that amount of money, but I'm thrilled that our film is out there and accessible. It's important to reach people with your movie, and Fathom gives us that opportunity.
I wasn't certain whether we were going to mention the HBO part. Does that help or hurt the Fathom release?
I don't think it matters. There's, I think, first place, not everyone gets HBO. Secondly, the Fathom is the full version of the Cold Blue. The HBO version, the opening sequence of Bud singing the song, that's not on the HBO version. And we have a prelude, we have a short subject, which is perhaps the trailer to my new film that I'm trying to get going, this incredible newsreel of the Nazi newsreel from World War II, from their perspective, shooting down B-17. So
that was an amazing opening to the film. The link, when I saw the film, the opening with the Nazi newsreel is fascinating because, of course, it was all rah rah, they're winning the war, which was
exactly,
which was
and
pretty
it puts
amazing.
Yeah. And then the making of will be at the end. So the Fathom is the Roadhouse version, and it's in it's in a giant theater with surround sound in the dark with your fellow Americans on Memorial Day. So
which
it's
is
a true event.
the best way to see it. Let's take a quick look at another very short a clip from the movie.
You had to farm up, and you had a circle you was supposed to fly till you got farmed up with your group, and then there'd be another bomb group over here, and one day we come within 3 or 4 inches of whacking up with another bomb group.
On some of them, when the young pilots had come in as replacements, if I was first man to take off, we'd be up in the air and say 200 or 300 feet climbing. All of a sudden, boom.
See a bright flash, a red flash, and stuff coming down. You knew darn well it was in mid-air collision. And those were scary times as far as getting up.
film is very powerful, and what I really like about it is that it's not a rah 50s John Wayne.
Oh no.
It's certainly, it makes you stop and think. And I think the other couple things that were just amazing to me were how young these men were that were flying these planes. They were 19, 20, 21. The old Pappy was 26 years old, which you brought out. And the other thing that was just sort of surprising and shocking is that there was no heater, no air conditioning. They had these open doors and open windows, of course, where guns were, and these guys had long underwear and gloves and everything, and it was 60 degrees below zero on some days. So it was very, you don't think of that, because in the war movies that we see, it's rah and shoot them down, and you don't think that it's, icicles in your oxygen mask, as they explained in your film. So.
Well, it's the quotidian details. It's the small things that people ignore. I was interviewed a couple days ago about where did you develop your obsession with World War II? And I said, well, probably when I watched Combat when I was 8 years old back in the early 60s, dating myself badly here. But I even remember as an 8-year-old wondering, well, how do the guys go to the bathroom? You never see them going to the bathroom. How do they do that? So, strangely, that question of the quotidian details. How cold was it? What did flak sound like? That's when I interviewed these guys, and I interviewed a composite crew of 9 guys, drove cross country, again, guerrilla operation. It was myself and Peter Hancock, the producer. That was it. Rent a car in LA, drive cross country, stopping at 9 people to interview them, with Peter and I on cameras and my laptop to screen it and in and out. But I was very careful never to talk to the guys about the details of when they entered the service and training and this and that. It was very, what did it sound like, feel like? What do you remember about the experience? And they'd never really been asked that before. And I was conscious of not doing a, quote, History Channel documentary, who, what, when, where, tell you what to think. As I think we talked about, Chuck, earlier last week, my original idea was to do Koyaanisqatsi with B-17s. I wanted to do a impressionistic art film that was Koyaanisqatsi meets Dunkirk meets Memphis Belle.
Well, it's all that. It's all that, and it's more, because you learn a lot. And Koyaanisqatsi, which I love, is much more free form and sort of less structured. And here you feel kind of like you're going through the process of these 20-year-olds in the plane. It's really scary. And it's definitely worth seeing. I highly recommend. We'll have this online available for the 23rd. I highly recommend people seeing it in the theater. What's your next project? Can you tell us what you're working on?
Well, you never know until you get a green light or the funding. But if I'm able to make any money off the Cold Blue, which you never know, and I've certainly never gone into a film thinking we'll make money. We got lucky with Grizzly Man, and Cave of Forgotten Dreams made a pile of money, but we didn't do it for that reason. But you saw, Chuck, the Nazi newsreel that came out of research I've been doing in the Bundesarchiv in Berlin. There's 700 20-minute to 30-minute nitrate prints of the weekly newsreel that the Nazis created from 1939 up to about a month before the war ended. And I'm doing a film that tells World War II entirely from the perspective of those films, using the original narration, perhaps redubbing it, but absolutely from the Nazi perspective. So it puts you in the jackboots to say, how could they have brainwashed themselves into doing these horrific things? What were they thinking? And this film, through its raw material, should address that. And the working title of it is Their Struggle, which is a play on Mein Kampf, Hitler, My Struggle, Hitler's book. But it's a tough sell because it's very, scary and rigorous and not necessarily what people want to watch. But in my eclectic career, as we say. I'm always interested in doing things that other people aren't doing, and things that people come to later and say, geez, that's interesting. I can't imagine you could make a movie out of something like that. Well, I think we can, and I'm hoping that we will.
Well, thank you very much, Erik. It's been a pleasure having you on Westdoc Online, and I wish you the best of luck.
Oh, thank you, Chuck.
It's an amazing thing, actually.
Diversity.
This is incredible.